We're continuing our series in the book of Numbers, and today we're looking at unbelief in the wilderness. Now, there's been many echoes around the world this week of unbelief. It's sort of an incomprehension at what's been happening in the US elections. But this isn't the kind of unbelief that we're looking at today in Numbers 13 and 14. Rather than it being an unbelief out of miscomprehension, it's an unbelief out of a lack of trust. When I go to the shops and I buy maybe the kids some biscuits and they see the packet and they're all excited, and I just say, look, we're going to have the biscuits later. I just need to get some stuff done. Don't touch them, and then you'll be able to eat them. And now there's a sense that they know what's been promised, but there's a temptation as to whether or not they'll trust that I'll deliver on my promise, that I'll give them the biscuit when I finish my other work, that my other work won't take so long that they'll starve or that they'll no longer enjoy the biscuit. It's the kind of belief that needs to be put into practice with action. Now, unbelief would be ripping the packet of biscuits open and eating them, not trusting that I will be gracious and that I will not be too long. Belief is being able to see that the biscuits are there and being able to wait. And so what we see in the wilderness in Numbers 13 and 14 is an inability to wait, an inability to trust that God is going to graciously give them a good thing, and that the ability of Him to give it can overcome all the obstacles that they find. And now what if I said to you, you can have this house if you're willing to wait? Well, that's the situation that a couple found themselves back in 1999 over in neighbouring Birchgrove. They had just bought a property that was the neighbour to this building that's pictured here. And the elderly occupant of this house said to her new neighbours, if you don't extend your house, and if you take care of me in my older age, then I'll give you this house when I die. It will be yours. And you can then develop your house however you want. Now, in a renovation crazy country like Australia, especially back in the early 2000s, this was a fair bit of denial. This required the couple to deny themselves their dream of extending their property. Now you might think, well, it's probably worth it. But for them, they had to trust this lady at her word. And it wasn't until over a decade later that this lady had died, that this couple had cared for them, that they then saw the will that she'd written. And rather than the promise that she'd made of giving them not only the house that she lived in, but she owned the house next door, all they were entitled to from the will was $25,000. You see, they'd acted in belief at her promises, but when the time came for the promise to be realised, they came away very disappointed. And so in recent weeks, it's been in the New South Wales Supreme Court, the will has been contested, and the couple have actually had the decision overturned. The courts have sort of seen that they made decisions based on the verbal promise. They didn't renovate their house. They cared for the lady. And so now, because of the location of the property with its harbour views, they've inherited both neighbouring properties, valued perhaps at $40 million. The ability to believe people at their promise is shown when we sacrifice our own decisions. When rather than going ahead and taking our initiative, we wait for other people's promises to be realised. And so what we see here in Numbers 13 and 14 is perhaps the most pivotal account in this period. You see, God's people had been rescued from slavery in Egypt, and they were being delivered to the promised land. Now, we've spoken about last week that this period covers a period of 40 years. And that wasn't God's intention. He didn't want them to be wandering and rambling taking longer than was necessary. The reason that they wander for 40 years in the wilderness is because of the events that we hear of in these chapters. Their unbelief has consequences. God's response to their unbelief is to meet their consequences with just punishment. And for this generation, it would mean that they couldn't see the promised land. God's promise to them wouldn't be realized because they haven't met his promise in belief. So let's track through and see how that plays out. In Numbers 13, 1-3, we read this. The Lord said to Moses, "Send some men to explore the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the Israelites. From each ancestral tribe, send one of its leaders." So at the Lord's command, Moses sent them out from the desert of Paran. All of them were leaders of the Israelites. And what we see here is another selection committee, and this time a task force. Representatives from each tribe are sent to explore the promised land, the land that God was giving them. And they have to report back on the quality of the land and also who are the inhabitants that currently live in that land. This scouting and then the report back is to strengthen the Israelites' faith about what God is going to give to them. It's about them having a sense of the goodness and the generosity that is going to abound what they receive and the realization of God's plan. Going on in 13:21, so they went up and explored the land from the desert of Zin as far as Rehob toward Lebo Hamath. They went up through the Negev and came to Hebron, where Ahiman, Sheshai, and Talmai, the descendants of Anak, lived. Hebron had been built 7 years before Zoan in Egypt. When they reached the valley of Eshcol, they cut off a branch bearing a single cluster of grapes. 2 of them carried it on a pole between them, along with some pomegranates and figs. That place was called the Valley of Eshcol, because the cluster of grapes the Israelites cut off there. At the end of the 40 days, they returned from exploring the land. This selection committee, this group, they've gone and they've entered the land, they've explored it, they've been able to gather some of the produce, and they're going to return. And so rather than this being a picture of God's triumphant plan being realized, his promises being certain, this story starts to unfold as a tragedy. They've seen the land, they can testify to its abundance, but their ability to trust that God will provide it doesn't follow. And so in verses 26, we start to see and hear the report. They came back to Moses and Aaron and the whole Israelite community at Kadesh in the desert of Paran. There they reported to them and to the whole assembly and showed them the fruit of the land. They gave Moses this account. "We went into the land to which you sent us, and it does flow with milk and honey. Here is its fruit. But the people who live there are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large. We even saw descendants of Anak there." The selection committee comes back and they're reporting to Moses what they've seen. It is exactly as God had said from a landscape point of view. It's a land that is filled with abundance and life. It's a bit like the children looking at the biscuits that I've promised to them and saying, yes, they look delicious. And actually, as we take a bite, they are delicious. But it's actually not the whole picture. There's actually an emphasis not on the goodness of what God is providing, but actually on the obstacles. They are intimidated by those who inhabit the land. They're focused on the negative. It's like the kid who's unable to wait for the biscuits because they say, "Oh, you're going to take forever. I'm going to starve. I'm going to be so hungry." The report back is filled not with belief and faith in what God's giving, but rather unbelief and doubt. But it's not unanimous. Verse 30. Then Caleb silenced the people before Moses and said, "We should go up and take possession of the land, for we can certainly do it." But the men who had gone up with him said, "We can't attack those people. They are stronger than we are." And they spread among the Israelites a bad report about the land they had explored. They said, "The land we explored devours those living in it. All the people we saw there are of a great size." What we see here within the representatives of the selection committee is a voice of defiance. It's Caleb. He's trying to calm the people. He's trying to give some perspective. He's showing them that there can be faith that God will deliver this promise to them, that his plan is trustworthy, and that the prospects are good. But the rest of the committee brings this, what's called a bad report. They're distorting what they've seen. They're sowing lies that's detracting from truth. It's really an evil report about the inability that they see for God to deliver on his promise. And so despite Caleb's attempts to quiet them, the report that's been submitted actually stirs up this unbelief. And what it does is that it instills fear amongst the people. It accentuates the obstacles for God's promise to be realized. It talks about how large and how strong the people are who currently inhabit the land, and the impossibility of God to be able to deliver on his promise. And so rather than this land becoming a picture of hope, of fertility and life, it becomes this place of dread because of this bad report. A place that is about destruction, a place that seems to be really intimidating for God's people to venture. And so what we see here in the report is a contrast. They've got the produce, the beautiful grapes. They can taste like this land is actually as God promised it would be, something that is fertile and prosperous, life-giving. They accentuate the obstacle. They talk about themselves being like grasshoppers compared to those who inhabit the land. You know, this grasshopper, this sort of weak insect that is completely vulnerable, that's going to get squashed. And so that instills fear that stirs up an attitude of unbelief. And so with the report laid on the table, how is the rest of Israel going to respond? Chapter 14, verse 1. That night, all the members of the community raised their voices and wept aloud. All the Israelites grumbled against Moses, and the whole assembly said to them, "If only we had died in Egypt or in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us to this land only to let us fall by the sword? Our wives and children will be taken as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt?" And they said to each other, "We should choose a leader and go back to Egypt." There's a sense that there's shouting and there's weeping. The people are overwhelmed with fear. Their unbelief in God's plan is seen in their attempts to hatch their own. Anything now is better than trying to venture into this land. They've forgotten about how bad life was in Egypt, and now they're almost trying to elevate it as the desired location. They're not only giving up on God's plan, but they're developing their new one. Who's going to lead us in this direction to go back to where we came from, to go back to what is familiar, rather than to venture along this crazy plan that God's got, that we're going to enter this land that is filled with people who will crush us? Verse 5, then Moses and Aaron fell face down in front of the whole Israelite assembly gathered there. Joshua, son of Nun, and Caleb, son of Jephunneh, who were among those who had explored the land, tore their clothes and said to the entire Israelite assembly, "The land we passed through and explored is exceedingly good. If the Lord is pleased with us, he'll lead us into the land, a land flowing with milk and honey, and will give it to us. Only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not be afraid of the people of the land, because we will devour them. Their protection is gone, but the Lord is with us. Do not be afraid of them." Again, there's hope for God's people to turn from unbelief towards belief. Moses and Aaron, that they literally fall down in amazement at the unbelief of God's people. It's almost just like a despair about how unfaithful and disbelieving and forgetful God's people are being. And Joshua comes in also as someone who has scouted the land. He echoes Caleb's plea that no, this is God's intention. He will deliver on what he's promised. They too are distressed, and they call for God's people to repent, to act in faith rather than faithlessness. But all we see amongst God's people is an attitude of unbelief, despair, overwhelmingly consumed with fear, intimidated by what seems to be ahead, and all they want to do is return to what's known. And so then in Numbers 14 verse 10, but the whole assembly talked about stoning them. Then the glory of the Lord appeared at the tent of meeting to all the Israelites. The Lord said to Moses, "How long will these people treat me with contempt? How long will they refuse to believe in me in spite of all the signs I have performed among them? I'll strike them down with a plague and destroy them, but I'll make you into a great nation and stronger than they." So much is the revolt against the report of Joshua and Caleb that the people want to kill them. They want to remove this voice of dissent. They don't want to hear any reasoning that is going to try and convince them to head towards the promised land. God in his mercy protects those who have been faithful. And again, there's this great dilemma about the direction that God's people are going to take and their fortunes moving forward. Verse 36 continues. So the men Moses had sent to explore the land, who returned and made the whole community grumble against him by spreading a bad report about it. These men who were responsible for spreading the bad report about the land were struck down and died of a plague before the Lord. Of the men who went to explore the land, only Joshua son of Nun and Caleb son of Jephunneh survived. What we see here is a harsh but just response from God against unfaithfulness. These people didn't believe that God would deliver on his promise. And unbelief leads to death. God is the life giver. And failing to trust in him, whether in this case immediately or for all of us with our mortal bodies, it means that our ultimate destination without God is death. But there is grace. There is mercy. And the pathway to receive mercy is faith. Joshua and Caleb, they just trusted in God's provision. They too saw the obstacles. They saw the size and the physical status of those who inhabited the land, but rather than disbelieving, they trusted. And belief brings life. And so what we see from chapter 14, verse 10 through to 45 is the complexity of justice and mercy. As we see God and Moses interact with each other, as God sort of tries to get his head around the unbelief that so is prevalent amongst his people, where Moses pleads with God to act in alliance with his character. It's a really earthy and deep insight into the kind of relationship that God has with his people. This isn't just abstract. This isn't just theoretical applications. This is deeply personal. Personal for God's people and personal for God himself. In this intercession, Moses is calling on God to act according to his character. He's calling on God not to give up on his plan. And so we see the mercy of God given, that this generation, because of their unbelief, they wouldn't die immediately like those who had actually spied out the land and who had agitated this unbelief, but they will not enter the land. There is going to be consequences for their action. Friends, we need to realize that there are always consequences for unbelief. God just can't allow unbelief to go unnoticed. But God is committed to his plan of being with his people. And so his mercy is that the next generation will enter the land. They will receive it. Now we see here that the current generation sort of thinks that maybe God will forget about this over time, and so they sort of orchestrate their own initiative to try and get into the land. But they fail. Because again, they're trusting in themselves rather than waiting for God's timing and trusting in his provision. And so what we've seen here in Numbers 13 and 14 is that God gives the opportunity for belief to be realized. He gathered a variety of people from all the tribes to go in and actually see, to actually taste what he was given. About what he was going to give to his people. The plan was that they would report back about how good the future looks, about how gracious God is. But rather than reporting back, trusting in what God had shown them, they're overwhelmed by what seemed to be an obstacle to God's plan. And intimidation at obstacles that are real can easily lead to a sense of being intimidated. And that can easily mean that we live very fearful of opposition. You see, faith always involves risk. For the people at this time, the risk was physical. How would they inhabit this land that these physically superior people currently resided in? How would they become inhabitants, not slaves, but citizens of this prosperous and great land? Faith requires risk. And when we face risk, we can easily be intimidated. God's people here are consumed by fear. And fear can easily be stirred up to create a sense of impossibility. It can easily be used by individuals to establish only one option. And often that option is what has been known, what seems safe and actually achievable. But God has looked down on this world and seen that actually this world is so fractured that there's nothing safe in and of this world in and amongst its brokenness. And God was needing to set about a new creation, this promised land, this land that was set apart, this land where his purposes for life, where humans could flourish, where life would be productive, where relationships would be sound, could be realized. But all God's people could see were the risks. And so that's a great danger for us too. Faith always involves risk. Much of our disbelief in God is about minimizing our exposure, our risk. But as we do that, we show that we are trusting ourselves rather than another. And so God's people, as a consequence for their lack of faith, would have to wander in the wilderness. And that generation had received judgment. They would not inherit the land. They would never set foot in what God had promised. And as they raised the next generation, as they passed on the stories from their own life, the lesson that they were to accentuate was the significance of belief. That if this next generation waited, if they truly trusted, then whatever obstacles they see in the future to God's promises being realized can actually be overcome. Overcome not by their great strategy, but by God's ability to deliver on what He says. And so for us, there's many situations where we too are wandering in the wilderness, and the great lesson we are to learn is that of belief. Friends, where is unbelief evident in your life because you're so intimidated? What is it that you see as the obstacle that God Himself cannot even overcome? You see, it's in these seasons of life where again we're challenged with our faithfulness. It's those situations where God needs to demonstrate His faithfulness. Back to the biscuit scenario, if I just say to my kids, look, I've just got to finish this little bit of work and then you'll be able to have the biscuit. But then I go and attend to the work that I'm thinking of, but then I think, oh, the kids are quiet. Maybe I can do a little bit more. Or maybe I can go and read something for a little bit. If I'm not faithful to the thing that I said, then at what point can my kids be faithful that I'll deliver on what I've promised? Now, often we don't listen to what God is saying about what He is saying He's going to be faithful to. And so unbelief just manifests as we listen to our own narrative of what's going on in the events of our life. Now, we aren't the generation that's going to enter the promised land. In fact, we live much further on in the redemptive plan of God. And so what we see post-Jesus is actually that there is a similar situation that we now encounter. Now, in John's Gospel, as we've been looking at this year, there's this great sense that John's purpose in writing the Gospel is to report on all the signs and wonders that Jesus performed so that those who hear about it might believe that He is the one from God, the one who's bringing about a restoration of life. But the challenge for all who hear about the signs and wonders that Jesus has done is to actually not just believe that they happened, but believe in what they signify. In John chapter 12, it says, even after Jesus had performed so many signs in their presence, they still would not believe in Him. Again, belief is the core problem. It's the core priority for humanity to be in a relationship with God and to realize the very things that God is promising. Going on down to verse 42, yet at the same time, many even among the leaders believed in Him. But because of the Pharisees, they would not openly acknowledge their faith for fear that they would be put out of the synagogue, for they loved human praise more than praise from God. See this? The people believed in who Jesus was and what He had said, but there was a fear about the consequences of being open about that belief. They were intimidated. They were intimidated about how the Pharisees, the religious leaders, would respond if they openly confessed what their belief in Jesus actually meant to them. And friends, isn't that just the situation that we find ourselves in the modern day? It is intimidating to confess to your family, to your friends, to your work colleagues, that you ultimately trust that Jesus rose from the dead and that he is establishing eternal life. That's crazy talk for most people in the modern Western world. Fairy tales. Are you serious? Are you unintellectual? Are you a conspiracy theorist? But friends, that is actually the right response that Jesus is calling for. To believe in him. The belief in him is a confidence that he has done what he said he would do and that he will deliver on what he has promised. The ultimate promised land, this new creation where life will be better than just a land flowing with milk and honey and amazing grapes and pomegranates, but a life that is just abundant with all the good things that we can see without any of the fractures that are so common to human experience. Friends, it's particularly difficult in those relationships where we feel deeply intimidated, where we want to please those who are around us and don't want to be ridiculed and don't want our place of belonging to be jeopardized. It's in these moments where there is a great danger for us to foster unbelief. You see, for the Pharisees, the synagogue was their ultimate place of belonging. It's where they felt secure, it's where they were given respect, and it's no doubt a place where they had rich relationships. But for them, it became the obstacle for them believing in what God was establishing as his plan. The synagogue for them became more about their plan and their purposes rather than God's. Friends, what's your synagogue? What is the thing in your life that gives you ultimate security, where you feel respect, that you are unwilling to be open about your faith? Beware of that place. Beware of the unbelief that can so easily foster within it. Now, the antidote for unbelief is belief. Caleb and Joshua, they gathered the grapes also. They saw the intimidating obstacles for God's purposes to be realized. But more than anything, they clung to who God had shown himself to be. The rescuer. The one who was more committed to his purposes than they could ever imagine. The one who could ultimately be trusted in. Friends, let's be a people who don't deny the fact that there are very real situations where our faith is tested. Where we don't try and minimize the fact that there are real obstacles and that there will be opposition to us being open about our faith. But rather than retreating into disbelief, that we continue together to pursue belief. And we do that because God is faithful. He is merciful. And he has promised that all who call on the name of the Lord Jesus, that anyone who believes that he has risen from the dead and he's died in their place will inherit life. Life that never ends.